Canada's air defense problem in the 1950s was one of distance. A Soviet bomber heading for Ontario and Quebec would come over the top of the world, across thousands of miles where nobody lived and nothing was based. To see it coming, Canada and the United States built 3 radar barriers: the Pine Tree Line along roughly the 49th parallel, the Mid-Canada Line along the 55th, 98 stations finished in 1957 at a cost of $250 million, and the distant Early Warning Line, the DEW Line, agreed on February 15, 1954, reaching from Alaska to Greenland. Every dollar figure in this story is a Canadian dollar of the day. Radar only tells you something is coming. Somebody still has to fly out and meet it in winter darkness, with the nearest alternate airfield hundreds of miles away. In 1951, engineers at Avro Canada began work on a replacement for the transonic CF-100 interceptor. The early studies were designated C-104. There were 2, one with a single engine, one with 2. The 2 studies handed to the RCAF in June 1952 shared a low-mounted delta wing, Orenda TR-9 engines, and a Bay of Velvet Glove missiles. The wing would move up onto the shoulder of the fuselage later. The twin-engine version won because it was bigger, which allowed a far larger internal weapons bay, and because 2 engines mattered more than anything else over the Arctic and open water. In October 1952, the Canadian Aeronautical Institute went over both designs. That review carried it. In June 1953, the RCAF signed off on a reworked twin-engine design, the C-105. The requirement went out in April 1953 as RCAF specification. Air 7-3. Crew of 2, 2 engines, cruise at Mach 1.5 and 70,000 feet, a 2G turn at that speed and 50,000 feet without losing altitude, and 50,000 feet reached within 5 minutes of engine start. 300 nautical miles on a normal mission, 200 on a high-speed intercept. And it had to do all of that off a 6,000-foot runway. The RCAF went shopping first, Britain, France, the United States, and found nothing flying or on the drawing board that could do it. Wind tunnel work started in August 1953. Engineers built 17 scale models from 1/80th up to 1/6 and ran them in tunnels across Canada and the United States. 11 more were built to be flown for real. Nike boosters carried them up. 9 went up over Lake Ontario between 1955 and 1957 from the Point Pitre Range, run by the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, and 2 more from NACA's range at Wallops Island. 1/8 scale and about 10 feet long, they were boosted past Mach 1.7, radioed their data home by telemetry, and then went into the water with no plan to recover them. All 11 worked. One of the men working the models at Langley and Wallops Island was Robert Gilruth. Remember that name. At its peak in 1958, Avro Canada employed over 50,000 people, did about $450 million a year in sales, and was the 3rd largest corporation in the country. The group had more than 40 companies under it, and in 1956, the Canadian side brought in 45% of the revenue of its British parent, Hawker Siddeley. The CF-100, the C-102 jetliner, and the Arrow all came out of one assembly building at Malton. In December 1954, Avro was put under contract for 2 aircraft. It was called the Arrow. The military designation was CF-105. Jim Chamberlain became chief aerodynamicist and head of detail design. Chamberlain reported to James C. Floyd, vice president and director of engineering. Guest Hake was project designer, and Robert Lindley was chief engineer, still in the job when the program ended. The engine was the part that would not come together. The first choice was the Rolls-Royce RB-106, and the RB-106 ran late. Avro turned to the Curtiss-Wright J-67, and the J-67 was canceled outright in early 1955. So they went with American Pratt and Whitney J-75s as a stopgap until Orenda's own PS-13 Iroquois was finished. The RCAF's timetable could not be met by building prototypes first and production aircraft afterwards, so Avro did not build prototypes at all. Under the Cook-Craigie plan, the first test airframes were laid down on production jigs as production aircraft, and anything the test program turned up got cut straight into the jigs while the line kept moving. Floyd's own summary: They took the technical risk to buy the time. The bill for that gamble came due on the day of cancellation. The airframes, the jigs, and the tooling were all the same investment. In early 1955, work started on the first airframe, and a year later on the second, both of them Mark I. The first was finished in the summer of 1957. It rolled out on October 4, 1957. On March 25, 1958, veteran test pilot Janusz Zurakowski took it up for the first time. About 12,000 people came to Malton for the rollout. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 the same day, and by the next morning, the Arrow was off the world's front pages. The aircraft Zurakowski took up was RL-201. The flight lasted 35 minutes and reached 400 knots. He found the Arrow easier to fly than the F-102 or the Gloucester Javelin. In December 1952, he had become the first person to take a straight-wing jet past the speed of sound in a CF-100, and he retired from test flying late in 1958. On its third flight on April 3, 1958, it went supersonic in a climb, not a dive, Mach 1.1. Most of its contemporaries could only do that going downhill. 15 days later, it reached Mach 1.52. RL-202 first flew. That August, RL-203 in September, RL-204 in October, and RL-205 on January 11, 1959. RL-206, the first Mark II with Iroquois engines installed, was ready for taxi testing and never flew. 4 men flew the Arrow. Ladislaw Potocki, known as Spud, logged 34 hours, 35 minutes, and was the only pilot to fly all 5 aircraft. Peter Cope was the only man ever to land an Arrow away from Malton, putting RL-204 down at Trenton on February 2, 1959. Flight Lieutenant Jack Woodman was the only serving military pilot who ever flew it, and the only Canadian-born pilot who did. Across 11 months, the 5 aircraft flew 66 times for 70.5 hours in the air, and Potocki flew the last of them on February 19, 1959. The Arrow was built to reach Mach 2. That was the design number the airframe and the Canadian engine were aimed at, and it is the number the Americans were chasing at the same time with the F-102 and then the F-106 against the same Soviet bombers. What it actually did is a different story, and the legend has this aircraft doing things it never did. Start with the engines. Every one of those 66 flights was made on Pratt & Whitney J75s, the interim American engines. No Arrow ever flew with an Iroquois. The fastest run recorded came on November 11, 1958, with Potocki in RL-202, and the quoted figure runs anywhere from Mach 1.95 to 1.98. The higher numbers are indicated readings taken in a shallow dive, and in steady level flight, it is Mach 1.9. It never got to the design number. The highest altitude recorded was 58,000 feet, against the 60,000 it was designed for. Peter Cope recalled that the team had expected roughly Mach 1.6 and got close to Mach 2, and that with the Iroquois they talked of Mach 2.3 or 2.4. An engineer's projection, not a measurement. 2 of the 5 came off the runway. On June 11, 1958, the left main gear on RL-201 collapsed on landing because it had not swung back into line with the fuselage. The second accident to RL-202 was the same sortie as that fastest flight. At touchdown, the flight control system commanded the elevens fully down, which unloaded the gear, locked the brakes, and burst the tires, and the right main gear broke off. A photograph taken during the accident later settled it. The flight controls had moved on their own. It was not the pilot's braking. What drove the price was not the airframe. The original plan was the Hughes MX-1179 fire control system and 8 Falcon missiles. In 55 and 56, the RCAF went a different way. The RCA Victor Astra system and the Sparrow 2 missile, both to be developed in Canada. Avro objected formally. Neither had entered testing, while Hughes and Falcon were nearly ready, almost as good and far cheaper. Avro was overruled. Astra had been estimated at $72 million. By 1958, the projection was $208 million. The government killed both on September 23, 1958. The F-86 had cost around $400,000 and the CF-100 just under $1 million. By 1955, the Arrow was going to run $2 or $3 million apiece. Diefenbaker cut the order to 100 aircraft. That drove the unit cost up, and the higher unit cost made the case for killing it. Defense Minister George Pierce had been pressing for cancellation since August 1958. The Cabinet Committee refused him twice and set a full review for March 31, 1959. By 1956, Avro was tooling up to build the Mark II with the Canadian Iroquois in it. The first 32 were supposed to reach the RCAF by late 1959. Then on February 20, 1959, the Canadian government killed it. The reason given was cost. Buying the whole 100 aircraft and finishing the development behind them would have come to $1.6 billion. The announcement was made in the House of Commons that Friday morning and covered the Iroquois engine as well as the aircraft. That was more than a month before the review the Cabinet had scheduled for itself, which is the best evidence there is that the decision was political, not analytical. Diefenbaker said the Soviets were devoting themselves more and more to missiles, and that by 1962, the Arrow would be ineffective. Audit records put the money actually spent on development at $384 million. The material for another 37 airframes was already sitting in the plant. Crawford Gordon, who had run Avro Canada since October 1951, met Diefenbaker exactly once, on September 17, 1958, and the meeting was a disaster. By one account, he ended up pounding the Prime Minister's desk. On the day of the cancellation, it was Gordon who got on the plant PA and read out the termination notice and told 14,000 people there was no work for them. Ottawa's answer was the Beaumark, a surface-to-air missile, cheaper, and they thought better. The Beaumarks went to North Bay in Ontario and La Macasa in Quebec, 56 missiles in all, and they arrived in 1961 without their nuclear warheads. The squadrons did not become fully operational until December 31, 1963, when the warheads came, which means the Arrow's replacement stood on alert, unarmed for nearly 3 years. The missiles cost $164 million, with another $107 million for Sage. By 1961, Canada was buying 66 F-101 Voodoos from the Americans, and it paid for them not in cash but by taking over the staffing and funding of 11 Pine Tree Line radar stations the USAF had until then run itself. The 5 squadrons they equipped replaced 9 squadrons of CF-100s. Canadair had already been picked in August 1959 to build 200 Lockheed Starfighters under license at Cartierville as the CF-104. That aircraft did not take over the Arrow's job. It replaced the Sabre in Europe, its 8 squadrons switching from air defense to nuclear strike, and its R-24A Nassar radar was configured for air to ground work only. They called it Black Friday. 14,000 people lost their jobs in a single day, the Avro and Orenda payrolls laid off that afternoon, and behind Avro were more than 650 subcontractors, which took the total closer to 25,000 once the supply chain caught up. Dennis McDermott of the United Auto Workers said Canada would now lose the cream of its skilled aircraft technicians to the United States. On April 30, 1962, Hawker Siddeley, the British parent that had owned the company all along, dissolved Avro Canada and took over what was left of it. The order to destroy the aircraft followed a memo of March 26, 1959, in which Air Marshal Hugh Campbell, chief of the Air Staff, recommended scrapping. Pierce gave the order in April. RL-202 went first. It was gone by June 24th. The airframes were cut up with acetylene torches, and by August it had all been melted down. The scrap went to a junk dealer in Hamilton, Ontario, at 6.5 cents a pound, and drawings, blueprints, and models went the same way. Nobody ever publicly accepted responsibility for the order. There isn't much left. The nose and cockpit section of RL-206 is at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, the largest intact piece of an Arrow anywhere. It survived because somebody wanted it for high-altitude pressure work, and it spent years as a pressure chamber before being donated to the museum in 1965. The museum also holds wingtips from RL-203. The story that one arrow was flown to England always lands on RL-202, the one that was cut up first. The engineers scattered quickly. Robert Gilruth arranged to take an initial group of about 25 Avro men south under Chamberlain's leadership to work on Project Mercury. And by the time the hiring was done, 32 Canadian engineers and technicians had joined the Space Task Group. Chamberlain had a major hand in the final design of the Mercury capsule and became program manager for Gemini. Owen Maynard rose to Chief of Systems Engineering for Apollo, and Tequin Roberts became NASA's first flight dynamics officer. Others went back to Britain and worked on Concorde, Jim Floyd among them. On February 20th, 1962, 3 years to the day after the cancellation, John Glenn orbited the Earth. The Arrow was built to cover a country that size with a handful of squadrons. It had to be a true all-weather interceptor, day or night, in Arctic weather. That meant heavy avionics and a lot of fuel. 50-foot span, 1,225 square feet of wing, and 49,040 pounds empty for the Mark I. The Convair F-106 Delta Dart, doing the same job for the Americans, weighed 24,420 pounds empty with 661 square feet of wing and one engine. The Arrow weighed twice as much empty with nearly twice the wing, and yet its wing loading was the lower of the two, 46.5 pounds per square foot against 52. The MiG-25, which didn't fly until 1964, was about 78 feet long. The Arrow was 77 feet 9. 2 seats, 2 engines, a tailless Delta, with the wing mounted high on the fuselage. The leading edge was swept 60 degrees. The airfoil was 3.5% thick at the root and 3.8 at the tip, and the leading edge drooped 8 degrees at the center section down to 4 at the tips. The wing had 4 degrees of anhedral, which let them use shorter main gear. Sitting the wing that high on the fuselage bought them access. Ground crews could drop an engine or pull the whole weapons pack straight down out of the aircraft. Halfway along the leading edge was a step, usually called a dog tooth, which increased the chord of the outer wing by 10%. Its job was to control the way the boundary layer drifted outboard along a highly swept wing. The outer leading edge was extended and slotted to keep the wingtips flying at high angle of attack, and the wing carried a slight negative camber on the upper surface to cut trim drag at supersonic speed. A tailless Delta has 2 chronic problems: pitch up and trim drag once you go supersonic. The dogtooth, the extended leading edge, and the camber were all aimed at those 2. A wing 3.5% thick also has almost no room inside it. The hydraulic lines and flight control runs had to be routed straight through the wing fuel tanks. The structure was semi-monocoque, mostly aluminum alloy. Floyd thought that was good past Mach 2. Past that, the heat would have forced a different material, which is why the Mach 2.4 talk was always a projection with a materials problem sitting under it, and why the airframe rather than the engines is where this design ran out. It was flown on elevons, one set of trailing edge surfaces doing the work of both ailerons and elevators. The nose gear had twin wheels side by side, and the main gear carried its wheels in tandem. The fuselage was area-ruled. There was a drag chute in the tail and speed brakes underneath. How those surfaces were driven is the most misreported thing about this aircraft. The Arrow flew with the first 4,000-pound per square inch hydraulic system in aviation, and the higher pressure was not showing off. A wing that thin cannot house large actuators, and raising the pressure was the only way to shrink them. The controls were fully powered and irreversible. The stick contained pressure-sensitive transducers, so the input was stick force rather than movement, and the signal traveled electrically to servo valves. An artificial feel system gave the pilot something to push against, and a separate damper moved the surfaces independently of him in all 3 axes. Several sources call this one of the first fly-by-wire systems in the world. People who know the system say flatly that it wasn't. Skip the label and describe it. An electrically signaled control system, a force-sensing stick, artificial feel, full-time stability augmentation in all 3 axes. Flying in 1958. That thin wing is also why the main gear did something genuinely odd on retraction. Each main gear had to shorten itself and rotate as it came up in order to fit inside the wing. A chain mechanism did the shortening. That is what jammed on RL-201 in June. The crew of two sat in tandem in separate cockpits on Martin Baker Mark C5 ejection seats built at Collingwood, Ontario. The navigator in the back had two small side windows and no forward view at all, and for most of the flight test program there was nobody in that seat, just ballast. The J-75 was heavier than the Iroquois the airframe had been designed around, so more ballast went into the nose to bring the center of gravity back where it belonged, and Astra was not ready either. No radar was ever fitted to a flying Arrow. The Mark 1s flew on two Pratt & Whitney J-75s, each producing 16,500 pounds of dry thrust and 24,000 with the afterburner lit. Production aircraft were to get the Orenda Iroquois, designed for 19,840 pounds of dry thrust and 30,000 pounds in afterburner. Avro's gas turbine division, later renamed Orenda Engines, had started on it in 1953, and Hawker Siddeley's design board signed it off in September of that year. The first Iroquois ran on December 15, 1954. It was a twin-spool turbojet with a 10-stage split axial compressor and a pressure ratio of 8:1. Swallowing 420 pounds of air a second. It weighed 4,650 pounds dry, and about a fifth of that weight was titanium, mostly in the compressor rotor blades, saving an estimated 850 pounds against steel. At the 30,000-pound design rating, that gives a thrust-to-weight ratio of 6.45:1, against roughly 3.8:1 for the J-75 that flew in its place. On the test stands, it was never run that high. It was rated there at 19,250 pounds dry and 25,000 with afterburner. And at those numbers, it was still the most powerful jet engine running anywhere. It did fly, though never in an Arrow. In 1956, the USAF loaned Canada a Boeing B-47B Stratojet, which Canadair rebuilt as the CL-52, with the Iroquois hung in a pod on the right side of the rear fuselage. It was a miserable airplane to fly. One Iroquois outthrust about 3 of the B-47's own engines. Thomas Cooper Slipper flew it for about 35 hours. The Iroquois program was killed on February 20, 1959, the same morning as the aircraft. The intakes were on the sides of the fuselage, one for each engine, rectangular, with a movable vertical ramp and large splitter plates to keep the fuselage boundary layer out of the engines. They sat well forward of the engines, so a lot of the fuselage was taken up by ducting. Hughes Aircraft got the fire control system at the start. They had already built one for the CF-100. When the RCAF switched to Astra and Sparrow II, the production aircraft was to carry 8 Sparrows in an internal weapons bay instead. That bay was 16 feet 1 inch long, 9 feet 6 inches wide, and 3 feet deep, larger than the bomb bay of an Avro Lancaster or a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, and it took up more than a third of the fuselage. The whole thing was a removable pack, winched up into the fuselage on the ground and locked in, and the doors opened in 0.3 of a second. 8 Falcons had been the plan at the start. Once Sparrow II was canceled, what the aircraft would actually have carried was 4 Falcons and 1 or 2 Genie rockets. The Genie was unguided, a 1.5 kiloton nuclear rocket you fired into a bomber formation. 66 flights, 70.5 hours, 5 aircraft, 11 months. That is the entire flying record of the Avro Arrow, and every hour of it was flown on borrowed American engines with ballast in the nose where the radar was meant to go.